One thing I get asked in the shop quite a lot this time of year as we're coming into spring when the fish are being aggressive and competing is Jigga Rigs. Obviously, a lot of venues don't allow it for their own reasons. At Rookery we do allow it, and certain times of year, particularly for the F1's, it can be a devastating method. So I'm just going to run you how I would set up a Jigga Rig. It really is simple, and we'll go from there. So obviously the first component of a Jigga Rig is a jigger float. So there's quite a few different variants on the market. There's obviously Maver, New Fish, do some with a bit of weight in the body, just so when the line's passing through, the float sits more stable. The other style of jigger that people do use is an adaptation of a Drennan inline dibber. Basically it's clear, so a few anglers have adapted these throughout the years and they find them brilliant, but personally, not that I've done loads and loads of jigger fishing, the weighted ones do seem to fish a bit better, so we'll show you how to tie one of those. First thing is main line. I've experimented quite a bit with main lines, and when you're jigger fishing you want a nice stiff line, so if you were feeder fishing you would go for a fluorocarbon hook length because it's stiff, it doesn't tangle, and this is why I'm going to go for a fluorocarbon main line. It's 020, which is 4.3 kilos, so it is strong, but it'll be nice and stiff. The whole principle of a jigger is obviously the line passes through the float up and down, so you're constantly moving your hook bait up and down, and the fish hook themselves against this little stop here. So the stiffness of the line for me is a major thing to consider. So we've gone for 020 fluorocarbon, which is a Colmic King. You might say, oh, it's a bit heavy, but you can see straight away that this line is nice and stiff. So the first thing we need is some float stops, which I haven't got here. If by magic we've found some float stops. So there's lots of different manufacturers make float stops: Guru, Daiwa, Creluso, there's tons, Matrix, Cresta. I opt for a medium size in the Drennan ends on. They're nice and tight, they're not too big, they're the perfect size really. So I'm going to take my 020 main line, I'm going to pass that obviously through the little wire, let these come on, just going to moisten that off slightly. I'm just going to slide one of the quick stops onto the line, slide it off the two pieces of line and then onto the main line. Don't know if you can see that there. Right, next thing is the float. Just going to cut that bit off there, and we've gone for the MVR Series 9, which is the same as a New Fish one, very similar, which is a 4x14 jigger. Just going to slide that up there. Line there, you can see it's quite stiff, this line. And then put that there, and then we're going to do the hook length, which tie the loop for the hook length. Got a loop sizer. I'm going to use not the smallest one, the next size up, because the hook length I'm going to be using is going to have a band. So if I'm going to be changing my hook length quite regularly, I don't want too small a loop here because it becomes tricky to try and get your band and your hook and everything through. So just going to tie my loop on the second smallest setting, which is that one there. Just going to wet that. Always key when using fluorocarbon is keep the knots as wet as possible. I'm going to pull that up tight, slide that on there. So left with a fairly medium size loop. Then the shotting is really simple on a jigger. Couldn't be any simpler. As you can see on this one here, we've just got a bulk of 6 number 8s on there, So for the 4x14 one, which is slightly, we're going to put 4 number 8s on. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just going to slide them all just above that little loop in a nice little bulk. Now you could use dots for this, but because you're going to be catching a lot of fish, I've chose to use Balabini shot because I know it's going to stay on. If you're in a fish race and you need to catch numbers of fish, the last thing you want to be doing is putting more shot on. Depending on certain venues, you can overshot your rigs. So like on this one, I've put 4 number 8s. On some venues, you could even put more on just to stable your rig up. But that's something you need to play with at home. So that's the rig, simple as that. Obviously, next thing you need to do is apply your hook length. The next stage is, I think, is quite critical because the whole idea of this is being stiff. So the way you store it, normally you just put it on a normal rig winder, put it on, where you go. But because you want this nice and stiff, the best option is to store them on a little rig disc. Just stops all the little kinks and twists and stuff like that that you get off a normal winder. So all I do is I just take a staple, just a normal staple you get from any stationary shop. Just going to put that through the loop there. I'm just going to push that into the foam, like so. Push that nice and neat in there, and then I'm just going to wind it on. Try not to wind it on too tight, like so, otherwise you get kinks. Then obviously, depending on how long you want your rig, depending on the venue, how big a lash you can have, just bite that off, and then tie your double loop for your Dacron or however you're going to attach it to your elastic. So that's probably the best way, but well, the second best way, I would say. The best way is if you have got lots of the short shallow kits and you can have the advantage of leaving the rigs on your top kits. One, because it stiffens your line out, so you always know that that line's going to be nice and stiff. Plus, you're literally ready. You know, a lot of the top angles will have 6 or 7 set up at different depths, depending on the day, because when you're F1 fishing, changing the depth can be absolutely critical. Difference between getting a bite, a chuck, and no bites, or missing bites. And the other little item which is essential if you are going to store them like this is elastic savers. They come in a pack like so. They do 2 different sizes in a pack. If you're fishing really shallow and want it this end of your top kit, use the small ones. And then if you was like a full length rig, for the bottom end of your top kit, this band here will stretch. So not only good for jigger fishing, but any top kits, any shallow rigs really. So instead of pulling it down like so and having the elastic out of your pole, you're always going to be straining this elastic. So that's why they're called elastic savers. And hopefully I've covered the basics of a jigger rig. I'm no expert, but that's a simple jigger rig.